In this episode, we're going to clear up a confusion that makes privacy feel harder than it needs to be, which is the idea that there is one single set of rules you memorize and then you are done. In real privacy program work, obligations come from multiple directions at once, and a big part of managing privacy, well, is knowing which direction matters for a given situation. Some rules are territorial, meaning they depend on where people are located or where the organization operates. Other rules are sectoral, meaning they depend on the kind of business you are in, like healthcare or finance. Still others are industry-driven, meaning they come from contracts, standards, and expectations that may be just as powerful as law because they determine whether you can do business. The point is not to turn you into a lawyer, but to help you think clearly when different rules overlap so you can design a program that stays consistent. By the end, you should be able to explain how these rule types shape obligations and why privacy programs need a structured way to track and operationalize them. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A strong privacy program starts by accepting that obligations are shaped by context, not by a single universal checklist, and that context has multiple layers. Territorial rules are about geography and jurisdiction, which can mean where an organization is established, where it offers services, or where people affected by processing are located. Sectoral rules are about regulated activity, meaning the law focuses on a particular type of data or a particular kind of service, like health information, student records, or financial accounts. Industry rules are about what customers, partners, and oversight ecosystems expect, even when those expectations are not written as one statute. These layers can stack, so one processing activity might be influenced by a territorial law, a sector-specific regulation, and an industry standard at the same time. Beginners sometimes want a single answer to the question which law applies, but privacy program management is more about building a reliable method to determine obligations repeatedly. That method becomes part of governance because it influences policies, procedures, training, vendor terms, and how you respond when things go wrong. When you learn to separate territorial, sectoral, and industry rule sources, you stop guessing and start building clarity. Territorial rules shape obligations because governments generally regulate based on some connection between the processing activity and their territory or their residents. That connection might be obvious, like a company operating offices in a country, or it might be less obvious, like offering goods or services to people in a region through an online platform. Many modern privacy laws also include the concept of extraterritorial reach, meaning a law can apply even if the company is physically located somewhere else, as long as its activities connect to people in the regulated area. The practical point for a program manager is that geographic boundaries are not just about where servers sit, because the relevant question is often where the individuals are and how the organization interacts with them. Territorial rules can also influence what rights people have, what notices must include, what timelines apply to request handling, and what conditions trigger reporting duties. If your program treats geography as an afterthought, you end up with inconsistent responses and missed obligations. A mature program builds a way to identify where obligations might attach, and it uses that information to design policies and workflows that can scale. Territorial thinking is a core skill because it is the map that tells you which legal environment you are navigating. A sectoral rule shapes obligations differently because it focuses on a domain where the impact of misuse is considered especially serious, or where the government wants consistent controls. In a sectoral model, the same type of personal information might be treated one way in a general consumer context and a stricter way in a regulated sector context. Healthcare is a common example, where health information rules can be detailed and prescriptive about safeguards, disclosures, and permissible uses. Finance is another example, where customer financial information and fraud controls can create specific requirements for notices, sharing, and protection. Education can also be sectoral, where student records and learning data have their own expectations and restrictions. A sectoral rule often defines who is covered and what data is covered, which means obligations can depend on whether you meet the definition of a covered entity or a regulated service provider. The program challenge is that organizations can operate across sectors at once, such as a technology company offering services to hospitals and also to retail customers. A privacy program must be able to identify when sectoral rules attach and ensure operational procedures match that stricter context. Sectoral thinking is about recognizing when the same organization must behave differently in different lines of business. Industry rules and expectations shape obligations in a different way because they can emerge from contracts, audits, customer demands, and widely adopted standards that become non-negotiable for market access. Even when a standard is technically voluntary, it can function like a requirement because major customers will not sign a contract unless you meet it. Industry expectations also influence what regulators consider reasonable, because if a mature industry commonly uses certain safeguards, failing to use them can look negligent. Payment ecosystems are a classic example, where the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, PCI-DSS, can impose detailed security requirements that directly affect how certain personal and financial data is stored and accessed. Large enterprise customers often require vendors to demonstrate privacy and security practices through questionnaires, audits, and contractual commitments. Industry codes of conduct, certification schemes, and shared frameworks can also shape how organizations define acceptable processing and control maturity. The privacy program manager must treat these expectations as operational drivers because they influence vendor selection, product design, and incident handling. Industry rules are especially important because they can change faster than law, and they can spread quickly through supply chains. A mature privacy program tracks these expectations and uses them to strengthen controls before problems arise. Once you understand the three sources, the next step is to see how they translate into obligations that show up repeatedly, even when the specific rule text differs. Many territorial rules emphasize transparency, meaning the organization must clearly tell people what data is processed, why, and how choices and rights are supported. Many sectoral rules emphasize stricter control of sensitive data types, meaning access limitations, specific safeguards, and constrained sharing practices. Many industry expectations emphasize demonstrability, meaning you must be able to prove your practices through documentation, audits, and consistent operational records. Across all three, you often see obligations around data minimization, retention discipline, rights request handling, incident management, and vendor oversight. The exam is likely to test whether you recognize these common obligation families and can connect them to program artifacts like policies, procedures, and governance. Beginners sometimes assume each law creates completely new work, but many obligations are variations on themes that a well-designed program can implement once and adjust by context. The program goal is to build a baseline that meets broad expectations, then add specific controls where certain rules demand more. When you think in terms of obligation families, you can scale your program rather than rebuilding it for every rule. A practical privacy program approach is to build a requirements mapping mindset, even if you never call it that in daily conversation. The organization needs a way to translate external rule sources into internal controls and responsibilities, because obligations are not self-executing. This is where a data inventory and an understanding of processing activities become essential, because you cannot determine what rules apply if you do not understand what data you have, who you share it with, and where people are located. Territorial reach often requires you to know user location or residency context, at least at the level needed to decide which rights and notice obligations apply. Sectoral coverage requires you to know what kind of data is involved and what kind of service you are providing, because those are the triggers for specialized obligations. Industry expectations require you to know what customers and partners require and what commitments you have made in contracts. The mapping then becomes operational through policies and procedures that are written in plain, actionable language for teams. Without this translation step, privacy becomes a series of interpretations that never reach daily behavior. A program manager is measured by whether obligations become consistent practices, not by whether the organization can cite a regulation name. It also helps to understand that some rules are broad and principle-based while others are detailed and prescriptive, and that difference changes how you operationalize them. A principle-based rule might require appropriate safeguards, reasonable retention, or fair processing, which means the program must define what appropriate and reasonable mean in the organization's context. A prescriptive rule might specify particular steps, timelines, or required notices, which means the program must build procedures that reliably produce those steps on demand. Principle-based rules can feel ambiguous to beginners, but they are manageable when the program creates clear internal standards and uses risk assessment to guide choices. Prescriptive rules can feel safer because they are explicit, but they can be operationally challenging because missing a single required step can create a compliance issue. A mature privacy program can handle both by creating baseline controls that support principles and detailed procedures for areas where timing and specificity matter, such as rights request handling and incident evaluation. The exam often tests whether you understand that legal requirements must be translated into controls that work consistently. It is not enough to know that a rule exists. The program must be able to execute what the rule demands repeatedly. Territorial and cross-border considerations can add a layer of complexity because obligations may also relate to how data moves between regions. Even without focusing on technical transfer mechanisms, you should understand that cross-border movement can trigger additional requirements, such as ensuring appropriate protections are in place when data is processed in another jurisdiction. The program manager's job is to ensure the organization knows where data is processed and which partners touch it, because cross-border processing often happens through vendors, cloud services, and global operations. This is also where contracts and vendor oversight intersect with territorial rules, because the organization may need to impose requirements on partners to ensure protections are consistent with obligations. A beginner misconception is that cross-border issues only matter for large global companies, but many smaller organizations use global service providers, which can create similar questions about where processing occurs. A strong privacy program builds awareness of these flows through inventories and vendor management, then uses governance to ensure new vendor relationships are reviewed for territorial implications. When exam scenarios hint at international customers, distributed processing, or multi-region services, they are often testing whether you recognize that geography can shape obligations. The right response usually involves increasing visibility and applying consistent oversight rather than guessing. Sectoral and industry rules also intersect in a way that can surprise new learners, because one sector's rules can shape industry expectations even for adjacent businesses. For example, a vendor that serves healthcare organizations may face healthcare-driven contract requirements even if the vendor itself is not classified as a covered provider. Financial services customers may require strict safeguards and audit rights from vendors because their sector obligations demand strong oversight of third parties. Education-related customers may require strict controls around student data and access even when the vendor provides general software. This is why privacy programs cannot only ask what laws apply to us in the abstract, because obligations often arrive through the obligations of your customers and partners. The practical program response is to build a repeatable way to handle customer requirements, vendor assessments, and contract terms, so the organization does not reinvent its posture for every deal. This is also where stakeholder alignment matters, because sales and procurement teams need predictable privacy positions to move efficiently. When the program anticipates sector-driven demands, it reduces friction and prevents rushed commitments that are hard to meet later. The exam is likely to reward answers that show awareness of supply chain effects on privacy obligations. When you look at territorial, sectoral, and industry rules together, a key program skill is deciding when to standardize and when to tailor. Standardization means setting a strong baseline approach across the organization, such as consistent data inventory practices, consistent retention discipline, and consistent rights request intake procedures. Tailoring means applying extra requirements where the context demands it, such as stricter controls for regulated sector data, additional review for high-impact processing, or specific contractual clauses for certain jurisdictions. Standardization reduces mistakes because teams do not have to remember a different playbook for every situation, and it can improve speed because processes become familiar. Tailoring reduces risk because it respects real differences in obligations and impact, and it helps the organization avoid over-collecting or under-protecting in sensitive contexts. The program manager must balance both, because too much tailoring can overwhelm teams, while too much standardization can miss critical requirements. A mature approach often uses tiers, meaning baseline controls apply everywhere and additional controls apply when triggers are present, such as certain data types, certain user locations, or certain partner relationships. The exam often tests whether you choose an approach that is scalable and defensible rather than rigid and unrealistic. Another critical piece is change management, because privacy rules are not static and obligations can evolve through new laws, updated guidance, enforcement trends, and industry shifts. Territorial rules can change as new regions pass laws or update existing ones, and sectoral rules can change through regulatory updates or new interpretations that affect operational expectations. Industry expectations can change when major customers update contract templates, when standards evolve, or when high-profile incidents lead to new baseline safeguards. A privacy program must have a way to monitor these changes and translate them into updated policies, procedures, and training, because a program that does not evolve becomes outdated and inconsistent. This is where governance mechanisms like periodic review cycles and stakeholder communication channels become essential, because changes must be communicated and implemented across many teams. Beginners sometimes imagine privacy compliance as a one-time achievement, but programs are living systems that must be maintained. The exam is likely to test whether you recognize that ongoing monitoring and adaptation are part of program management, not optional extras. If a scenario describes new obligations or shifting expectations, the best answers often involve updating governance, training, and operational procedures in a controlled way. It's also worth addressing how to talk about rules without getting trapped in name-dropping, because new learners often think success means memorizing a list of law acronyms. It is helpful to recognize major frameworks like General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA, and Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA. But the exam's deeper goal is usually to test whether you can manage the obligations those frameworks represent through program controls. Names are labels, and labels change across jurisdictions, but obligations like transparency, rights handling, minimization, retention, vendor oversight, and incident readiness show up repeatedly. If you focus only on names, you may miss the practical implication, which is what the organization must do consistently. A program manager should be able to say, "This rule's source affects how we provide notice, how we handle requests, or how we control sharing," rather than merely citing a title. This approach also keeps your thinking flexible when a scenario uses a framework you do not recognize by name, because you can still reason about what kind of rule it is and what obligation family it likely drives. The exam rewards program thinking that remains stable even when labels change. Your confidence grows when you can connect rule categories to concrete program behaviors. As we wrap up, the big takeaway is that privacy obligations are shaped by where you operate and where people are located, by what sector activities you perform, and by what your industry and partners expect you to prove. Territorial rules influence jurisdiction, rights, transparency, and sometimes cross-border requirements, which means your program needs visibility into who is affected and where processing occurs. Sectoral rules influence how specific data types and regulated services must be handled, which means your program must recognize coverage triggers and apply stricter controls where needed. Industry rules influence market access, audit expectations, and demonstrability, which means your program must track commitments and build evidence through consistent controls. A mature privacy program builds a method to translate these rule sources into internal policies, procedures, and training, using inventories and governance to keep the system consistent as the environment changes. When you can separate rule types, recognize the obligation families they create, and design a scalable baseline with tailored additions, you are thinking exactly like a privacy program manager. That kind of thinking makes exam questions feel less like trivia and more like practical program reasoning.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.